Lori really let Lincoln really have it that day. Apparently, Lori had lost her phone and sense, since Lincoln had a history of lying throughout the years as he was a number one suspect. After yelling at him for 2 minutes straight, Lincoln was in shock of all the things Lori said to him. This this took then a turn into a scowl, and he finally yelled back, but Lori wasn't having it. She had Lynn and Lana finish his trash in the room to search up for Lori's phone, and at the end of the day, they found nothing. They not ruined Lincoln's room, but they also tore Bun Bun in half. Lincoln was more than furious. He stormed off of his room, slammed the door so loudly it echoed through the halls. Lori wondered if she had maybe a bit too harsh on Lincoln. That night fell and Lori was getting for bed and was getting a strange feeling crawling up at the back, like if something bad was going to happen. But she thought nothing of it. She woke up in an empty, white padded room with blood and scratches on the wall that seemed to be there for years, judging by the color and smell. She plunged her nose and then walked to a pile of bones of rotting animal flesh in the corner of the room. She looked around with nervous in her eyes, looking for an exit or way out of this putrid room. Then she noticed something very disturbed panel at the center of the room. She pulled on it and ripped it out of the floor, revealing an odd and dusty ventilation shaft that seemed to be abandoned for a while. Lori, looking disgusted at the cobwebs and the vent, along with the dead rats placed in the corner of the opening. But seeing that there was the only way out, Lori had no choice but to crawl through. Luckily, the vent was big enough for her to fit in, and she was easily able to squeeze her way in to make her way through the maze-like system. After a few minutes of crawling through the cobwebs and the gribs, she finally made it out of the shaft and into another cell. The room actually had a door, and Lori dashed through it quickly to only find a hallway filled with more doors leading to more cells. Lori timidly walked past to the doors filled with faces that strangely looked like her brother, but a deformed huge marks on the sprained of their chests, and messy stitches across through them. Dried out blood was the every part of the chest, including the neck, that was just swollen and hair coming from the open scars. The faces came variety of and some of sort of having bags over their heads, while the others were melting of globs of flesh dripping from the huge melted parts of where all the chin and forehead were. Their eyes were emptying, showing black empty holes, showing whatsoever. Lori then looked at the chair of her cellmates and noticing the white color and the huge cowlick. Of course, Lori then eventually examined the black tears streaming down the cheeks and looked at her speaking softly, raspy tongue. Lori! She felt overwhelmed by the emotion take over her body as she realized it was her mistake. She held back a few tears of sorrow as she quickly rushed behind the cells and a new hallway leading to the lobby. Potted plants in each corner. She sat by a nearby bench and recollected her thoughts and emotions. After a while, she finally noticed the elevator in front of her. Lori quickly got to her feet and ran over to the doors and pressed the button repeatedly. But after a couple of seconds of waiting, she looked over the headlights and noticing that they were bright, which was obviously meant that the elevator power was still down. Lori sighed, realizing that if she wanted to get out, she would need to find another way to restore energy to the elevator. So Lori pushed open to a nearby door leading into a new corridor. After searching for a few cells down the east wing of the building, she finally turned to the medical ward section, where she quickly made her way down the darkened hallway. That had been a little bit too much blood and scratches on the floor. Then she realized she fought. She looked closer and saw some bones on the ground with slobber and grin on them. Lori realized that the bones were human size and that the flesh was still on the door, which that meant this flesh was still kill. Lori, after looking disgusted realization, the past of the corpses turned out to be the hallway of checkup rooms. She searched for the few new offices and surgical stations only to find more blood and scratches. Lori was quick at growing tired of running around and that she needed to stay determined if she wanted to get out. She then proceeded to check the doctor's office, only to find a desk with a flashlight and a map. Lori quickly managed to grab the two items and examine them both. The map showed them where the power beaker was, which meant that she could understand where she was going through the hallway. Like a crazy person, she stopped and noticed one of the cell doors was wide open. Lori then looked to see a broken lock handle that she timidly walked over to examine it Using her flashlight to look inside to see if her inmate was gone, Lori, with a sigh of relief, detected nothing inside the cell, but Lori had a feeling that escaped her inmate was now wandering around that she and Lori did not know. Whatever, they did not trust him. But of course, for now, she kept her guard up. Lori then made her way back to the lobby and into the west wing of the asylum. She found two paths, one leading into the offices and the other leading to the maintenance. Lori quickly made her way down the maintenance hallway, leading into free sections. Lori then looked inside the boiler room, only to find a monkey key wrench in the corner along with a match. Lori rushed down the hallway to the locked door, and the words "the breaker" messily written on the tag and stamped into the frame. Lori used her monkey wrench to bash open the lock, only to find out that the lock was so strong. Lori glanced at the map again, noticing the boss's office in the business section of the building. So Lori decided to make her way to the hallway, but before she left, Lori checked the final room, the storage closet. It was filled with papers and files and messily scattered on the floor. Lori searched the room, looking for anything valuable, but she did notice a broken control switch covered in papers. Lori then took the switch and noticed that there was an open vent shaft in the corner. For some reason, had a shoe sticking out of the crack, which made something burst through it. Lori picked up the shoe to examine it and only realized it belonged to Lincoln. Lori then started to grow nervous because the inmate that had escaped the cell was only wandering around the building as if he was crawling through the ventilation. He could sneak up on Lori, which she least expected it. She quickly snapped out of her pool of thoughts and then made her way to the maintenance section. Lori then walked down the dimly lit office hallway, filled with bones and blood, grim and scratches all over the ceiling and floor, especially the wall. Lori then looked in fear and adrenaline rushing through her veins. She then took each step and managed to get through the corridor. After passing through, she gently pushed open the cracked door that read "Offices," covered the floor door written in a messy black substance, with the liquid dropping on the floor, making a disgusting puddle on the ground. She made her way to one of the offices. The room's door was completely destroyed, with cracks on the wood floor, along with other people's pipe leaking the water that was dripping each second. She made her way towards the desk by staying on the open edges, holding while praying to remain the floor under her break or crack. Luckily, she was able to get to the desk safely. She checked the desk's drawers, looking for the key that she needed, and at the end found a few paper clips and a half-eaten bubble gum with slobber all over it. Lori took the paper clips just in case if she could to continue down to the office, only to find nothing again. After checking the next few offices, Lori was still found nothing, and she had one more room left to go, the boss's office. As she crept on the door towards the office, she found nothing that she had least expected. She then noticed a shadow in the storage closets. The shadow quickly checked the filing cabinets like if they were looking for something important. Lori stood back up and put her hand over her mouth, trying not to make any sound. Lori started to walk slowly towards the boss's office, just as the shadow continued searching through the file, like a ravaged animal. Lori then started to sweat, fearing that her life was on the line. Lori eventually made it to the door, and just as she turned the knob, the shadow noticed her and let out a true hellish scream. Lori quickly opened the door and slammed it shut, and she pushed a few heavy crates to the door to keep the shadow from breaking in. Lori quietly panicked to herself and desperately searched the room for a key to the door behind her, was trying to give in. The cracks formed around the door as the crates started to fall over. Lori found that the final drawer was locked. Lori quickly took out her monkey wrench and bashed the lock over and over. The bangs of the shower grew louder and louder as she broke the lock. She quickly picked up the key and headed towards the nearest ventilation shaft. The door finally broke open, and the shadow burst through with a rage, letting out another ear-bleeding loud scream. Lori opened the vent and crawled through, leaving the shadow in the office. She finally got out of the business section of the asylum and ran back towards the maintenance hallway, looking at the hopefully locked door. Lori used the key to get inside the darkened room. Lori stopped her excitement and slowly examined the office while looking at the shelves and boxes, and the faded desk that sat in the middle. She then walked to the desk and looked at the papers that just laid there. She read the note and recognized the handwriting that it was her brother's. She had to read each line carefully. Her emotions started to swell up as she read each word. Lincoln hated her with all of his passion. Lori then dropped the paper to the ground and started to cry like she never did before. At all the times she yelled at Lincoln, sulked at him, and even the smallest problems. All the times that he grabbed him by the shirt and threatened him. All the times that led into Lincoln's hate, realized she grew every single day. Lincoln never did love her. Never had and never will. Lori just stood there, letting everything sink in as her tears streamed down her face like a raging river. Lori, Lincoln, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to make you feel like this. You're right. I am a terrible sister, and I deserve this. I understand what you finally felt like. I know what I have to do now. Lori just stood there, blankly looking at the door, but before she could think again, she noticed a breaker in the corner of the room and realized that if she wanted to show Lincoln that she was truly sorry, had to leave this place. She then slowly got to her feet and walked over towards the breaker. She opened the panel and flipped over the switch that labeled elevator. Then she walked over to the door ready to leave, but before she could, two shadows in the nearby window appeared out of nowhere. Lori fell to the ground from the shock as she looked up to see two shadows that were talking to each other. One appeared to be crying while the other one was trying to reassure. Lori quickly got to her feet and ran towards the door with a mix of emotions and fear and sorrow in the shadows. She then made her way towards the lobby, with pride in her heart, thinking of herself that she would apologize to Lincoln, but after all the thoughts that had stopped at the sight of the shadow that tried to kill her, she just sat on the ground, reading a book, totally obvious of Lori's presence. Lori then eventually slowly walked by him, but not there before stepping on the paper ball on the ground. The crunch and sound echoed through the halls, and the shadow dropped his book and got up. He stepped up into the light, revealing a horrific face. He looked like Lincoln, but all wrong. His jaw was outstretched into a point where it should have broke. The teeth were rotted with the grim all over him. His eyes were replaced with buttons. His shirt was torn and revealing parts of his swollen body, with hairs coming out of each glob of mutant flesh. His feet were twisted and bent like if someone broke them and twisted them. His arms were outstretched, and his bones and veins were showing the pile of pale skin. His hands were skinny, but the fingers were clawed up with sharp knives with each nail. It smiled at her with intense eyes and whispered the words, "Lori." She then took the sign to run, but before she could, Lincoln picked up the pace and charged at her. Lori dashed out of her way past Lincoln and into the hallway, leaving the lobby. Lincoln was furious and then raged, and then ran after her in the first place, with each step repeating the words, "Lori, Lori, Lori." She finally saw the doors to the open of the lobby, but before she could get there, Lincoln used one of his hands to cut into one of Lori's legs. She fell to the ground and raved in pain. Lincoln then crept under her with a huge grin, and then, of course, started to hurt Lori, but Lori ended up letting out a weak and muffled scream as Lincoln raised his hand again and started hurting her more. She then finally gained the strength and then hit Lincoln's face with her other hand. He fell to the floor sense as Lori punched a sensitive part of his head. Of course, Lori started to crawl through to the elevator, desperately trying to leave the wicked place. She pressed a button as Lincoln raised his claw for the final blow, was interrupted by an inmate pouncing on his back, and it was an old rusty screwdriver for stab it multiple times. Lincoln fell to the floor with all the blood and passed out. He then and his cellmate they stared at Lori before dragging the corpse off into the darkness. Lori looked at him and curiously the body of her brother that way. She then heard the elevator going ding to the doors and her freedom open as she crawled in. She pressed their button, and of course the button control panel led to the exit. The door is closed as the elevator moved up. Hope and overwhelmed her as she was about to leave this godforsaken place and head back to freedom. But after all that, hope was taken out of her grasp when the elevator started to go down at a fast pace. Picking up speed every single second, Lori tried to control the elevator by it, but it was no use. Lori then just closed her eyes and braced for impact as the elevator was about to crash. After a loud crash, it all went dark, and Lori woke back up in her bed. She was out of breath and she was sweating. She looked over her phone to find out that it was morning. She grew a smile on her face as she quickly rushed to Lincoln's bedroom, only to find a handwritten note stick to the front of the door. And with the words, "I'm sorry," messily on paper, Lori looked at the sorrow note as she walked away from the door. She still wasn't ready for what was behind that door. And that, my little pretties, was Illusions, a Loud House Lost episode creepypasta written by Gnome Warlord. Gnome Warlord, thank you so much for writing this story. This was highly appreciated. Thank you so much. I had fun reading this story. Now my final thoughts of the story. Now I kind of remember the original one was called Lori, and that was the one Space Voyager wrote. Well, not wrote, but he narrated it. But it wasn't really that great because there was some, issues with the story. Now I could definitely say that this story was better than the original one. I know it's a rewrite, but this is a rewrite, but still. I could definitely say this story was actually pretty well made in detail. Especially with, the whole thing went out. Now, the grammar was alright, but there was just, there was just a few more, I guess you could definitely say there was a few, errors in the story, like a few grammatical errors in the story, so it was kind of one of the reasons why I had, trouble narrating it because of that. But with that being the case, and with that being said, I actually, wasn't really a fan of this story when, the story was good. It had a pretty good concept and all that. But I could definitely say that this story was actually pretty well made in detail. So, with that being the case, I actually found this story to be rather enjoyable. Now, I could definitely say that the story actually, had a pretty good concept with what was going on. I definitely say this was an interesting story. I really do find it to be pretty good. So, with that being the case, and with that being said, I actually found this story to be rather good, in my opinion. Although there are some issues. Now, one of them being that the story itself, the grammar was good, alright for the most part. Same with the sentence structuring. But there were a couple of run-on sentences throughout the story. So that was kind of why the story was a little bit hard to read at certain parts. So that was kind of why I really was having a little bit of trouble reading the story. But with that being the case, and with that being said, the story, for what it was, it did have a better explanation than the first one, Lori, the original one. But this one had a very good explanation. Now, this kind of explains, why Lori was in a mental asylum and why all this stuff was going on the way it did. And to be completely honest, I actually found this one to be a lot better than the original one, Lori. The original one that said Lori. So, with that being the case, and with that being said, I found this story to be rather, amazing. Well, it was a pretty good one, but there are a couple of, issues that I could definitely say that does need to, be, redressed. Now, not gonna lie or anything like that, the story itself was actually basically better than the first one. But with that being the case, it was actually a pretty interesting pasta for what it is. Now, the few errors I could definitely say were, a few punctuation errors and grammatical errors, so they just need to be fixed up. But with all that only being the only exception, the rest of the story was actually pretty interesting. Now, I would suggest maybe putting for this Google Docs, so then that way you can, they could correct the spelling mistakes and even the punctuation and grammatical errors. So, to know more, Lord, the story was good, but I would suggest, putting your story through Google Docs before you post it. So then that way, they can really detect on, where the grammatical errors and all that are from. So then that way, you will be able to improve on, the story. So, with that being the case, and with that being said, that's all I have to say about, that. So, with that being the case, I could definitely say the story was interesting. It did have a good potential and concept, which it did. But there was like a couple punctuation errors and grammatical errors. So that's kind of why I had a little bit of trouble reading it. And another thing I want to make a mention is some of the paragraphs and paragraph structuring in some paragraphs were pretty big. Like there were a couple big paragraphs. So parts of the story it was a little bit difficult to read. It was a little difficult to read, part way through because of the paragraph. Some of the paragraphs were pretty big, so when the paragraphs are pretty big, they actually some of the paragraphs were actually big. So some of them were like too big to the point where, I was having a little bit of difficult time to read because of, the whole, the fact that it was just it was just a little all over the place. So that's definitely the reason why I didn't really care for this. So with that being the case, and with that being said, with that being said, if you're gonna do like a paragraph, you gotta make sure the the paragraphs are not too big, because if you make up like a big paragraph, then with a story or anything like that, then that could cause a little bit of issues. Like, people could have a hard time reading your story if you sit there and have big paragraphs. So that's kind of why it was a bit confusing to read. But other than that, the story was actually interesting for what it was. It was pretty cool. But I would suggest, maybe putting it for Google Docs and that, and it'll get through it. So, yeah. Anyways, with that, with the exception of those few issues, the story was actually pretty interesting for what it is. So, with that being the case, and with that being said, what did I actually think of this story? A pretty good pasta, actually. Really do like it. Really do think it's really well made in detail, and it's actually pretty good for what this story was. So, I guess with that being said, and with that being the case, I'm gonna sit there and, explain this right now, that this story was actually alright. It could have been better, but this story was actually pretty well made for what it is. So with that being the case, and with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up the story, because I already explained some stuff about it, so yeah. Anyways, with that being said, and with that being the case, like I'm gonna say right now, and like I always continue to say, this is simply my own personal opinion, and if you happen to disagree with me, that's fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions in regards to these creepypastas, and this is simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of this story, I'm gonna give this one a 6 out of 10. I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 because it was pretty much more better than the original story, Lori, the first one. And I know this is like a rewrite, so yeah. And the reason why I'm also giving it a 6 out of 10 was because the grammar was alright, same with the sentence structuring, and the paragraph structuring needs to be, fixed up. The same thing could be said with the grammar and the paragraph and the sentence structuring. But other than that, the story was actually pretty well interesting for what it is. It did have a good concept to it, so that's actually another reason why I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. But yeah, with that being the case, with that being said, what did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you all enjoy it? Did you not? Also, what would you have done personally to help make this story a lot better? Leave me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section down below. I'm the Queen of Lions. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you happen to be brand new here on this channel, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because I make brand new videos every single day. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to when I upload, so then you guys will not miss an upload. And as always, please roll the outro, because I'm out.